Hello and welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography. Today we are speaking with Matthew Cunningham, the founding principal of Matthew Cunningham Landscape Design based in Stoneham, Mass. And Portland, Maine, and founder of MCLD Land Lab. Blending traditional Yankee building techniques with purposeful design, Maine native Matthew Cunningham is well known for his plant-centric landscapes throughout the Northeast. His gardens feature ecologically impactful planting schemes and regionally sourced materials that evoke an authentic sense of place, showcasing his team's ability to strengthen the connections between interior and exterior spaces and shape experiences that grasp the dynamic rhythms of everyday life. With robust studios in Massachusetts and Maine, Matthew Cunningham's firm, MCLD, is a celebrated leader in the design community. As a lecturer at Harvard Graduate School of Design, he inspires future generations to deploy the powerful medium of plants to address the ongoing impacts of climate change. Our interview today is sponsored by Maine Home Design. Don't miss Matthew's design theory in the upcoming October issue of Maine Home Design. Thank you for coming into the studio today, Matthew Cunningham. Matthew Cunningham, welcome to Architecture, Design, and Photography.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I have a series of questions that will lead to many more questions. Question number one. You were born and raised in Down East Maine. What pulled you to Massachusetts, of all places? And what inspired you to return and grow your practice here?
Great question. So I grew up in Bucksport, about halfway up on the coast. And
Bucksport?
Yeah, Bucksport, up there in Bucksport. And
we should have to do the whole podcast.
The whole podcast.
In strong Maine accent.
I can do it.
Welcome to Architecture. I don't know that I can accurately do a Maine accent. I probably default to Boston. I'm not from Maine originally.
It's close, but it's a little bit more Yankee.
A little bit more nuanced. Okay, so you're from Bucksport.
I'm from Bucksport, and I'm believe it or not, a fourth-generation Mainer. My great-grandparents settled in Bucksport, and my grandparents my grandfather was a woodcutter, and my grandparents had a subsistence farm, and I've been really fortunate. I now own the farm, and I'm doing a big renovation there, and so this land's been in my family for a long time. And
how many acre farm?
It's about 30 acres. I've stitched it together over the years. It was originally a 50-acre piece of land, and so I've been able to kind of assemble small pieces back together. And my dad worked as he worked in the Champion and St. Regis paper mill for 37 years, and my brother was a scallop diver, and my mom was a hot lunch lady, and pretty working class family. And I always had an interest in plants as a kid, and of course growing up I was always going to Acadia and going through the carriage trails, and Fort Knox was right across the water from where I grew up. And so as I got into like junior high, you start taking those like what should you do for a living kind of quizzes that the guidance office would send you to, and they told me I should be either a chef or a landscape architect. And I love to cook, I love to eat, but plants were really like in my soul. So farm to table is exactly. So I was really interested in pursuing a degree in horticulture, but there was also something that told me I should be looking at design as well. And at the time, UMaine didn't have a landscape architecture program, so I ended up going to UMass Amherst, had an amazing education in landscape architecture. And then right after school, early 2000s, I got a job in Boston and settled down, and a few years later started my practice, and I've been there since. But I believe very firmly that it's kind of dorky, but the places we're from really shape who we are and definitely influence who we become. And so those childhood influences and the places where I grew up really shape not just my aesthetic perspective, but also the way that I like to live in a place. So at the start of the pandemic, I had an opportunity to expand my practice up here, and it was like a big coming home party. Found a great space in Portland, and we've been there since.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. So what's that say about me? Because I'm not really from anywhere I move like every 3 to 5 years growing up. Like,
that means you take a little of every time that you've been somewhere.
So I'm like leftovers.
It's like a big collage or a puzzle. Yeah.
Right, just leftovers piled into the microwave. Like, here's a kind of thing.
Throw it on one. Yeah, heat it up.
So how's the transition to do you find yourself living in Maine now, or you have satellite offices and you're still based in Massachusetts?
I have to live in Massachusetts. I teach, so I'm required to be a
right. So
you
teach at Harvard.
I do. Yep. Yeah. I'm in the graduate school design and the landscape architecture program.
Oh wow, cool.
And so I've been in Massachusetts. I live in a town called Boxford, which is up on the North Shore. It's in the deep woods, so it's literally the closest place that kind of feels like home compared to Bucksport.
Right.
But I'm as I mentioned before, I'm in the process of renovating my grandparents' house, and so my goal is to kind of split time between the two places and really have a bigger footprint here.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it's hard to leave. Every time I go south and start heading towards the border, I start like twitching.
Mm-hmm. I have this experience when I'm at home and I see a plane going over. It's just a sense of dread because I hate being in that plane, looking down, knowing that there's my home and my family's there, and I'm like, I might die in this plane.
Yeah,
I don't like flying. So, second question. You've spoken often about the cumulative impacts of residential landscape architecture. What does this mean to you, and how does this statement influence your firm's work?
So,
cumulative impacts of residential landscape architecture. I think I know what you mean from it, but I'm not going to say anything to see if I'm close.
So I early on in my practice, I devoted my work to residential landscape architecture, and there are lots of different. Like, to me, landscape architecture, similar to medicine or law, is both a generalist and a specialist profession.
Okay.
And so I specialize in residential landscape architecture. And I started, my first few projects in the Boston metro area were in Cambridge and Brookline and some of the larger, more affluent suburbs of downtown Boston. And, like as a business grows, one client might say to another, like, hey, you've got to work with Matthew Cunningham on your project. And about 8 or 10 years in, I started realizing that I was having a pretty significant influence on the shaping of neighborhoods. And so I started in 2011 developing these diagrams that show parcel by parcel within a square mile in Cambridge, one in Brookline, and one in Newton, and started looking at the connectivities between these yards and realized that in some like, for example, in Cambridge, I've influenced over 90 acres of residential landscapes, which may not be quite as big as a park, but if you start looking at the connectivity between each of those yards, each of those properties, think about the character of place, the connection to context, the potential for supporting habitat and enhancing biodiversity. There's really tremendous potential there. And so, again, as my firm keeps growing and evolving, I really think of this as a way to stitch site-specific ecologies back together within a context. And so I think it's had a tremendous influence on the way that I think about design and a particular parcel within a particular place.
That's certainly an interesting way of thinking about it. I never really thought about it that way. What I was kind of similar in my thinking is that, yards in some sense are a flex of, look at all the monoculture that I can cut to the same length. Mm-hmm. There's many acres, and I live at the back in the center, and I can get you with a bow and arrow before you get across it, or there is an oddity to what we do with grass as a monoculture.
Agreed.
That we, in our home, we try to keep the grass as small as possible and only use relocating plants from the property to fit the property out, which has actually been really fun. You go out into the woods and select a little pine tree that you want to move and figure out how to get the tractor in there, dig it up and replant it and get everything going. And we've done that with a few now, and it's actually pretty cool because you go out there as a family and move it, and it grows. And
well, that's exactly the kind of meaning, though, that you want to instill in your your family, you want to create a connection to place with your family and your kids especially. But it extends more to every aspect of a modern lifestyle. Like, people want to be immersed in a place and feel that they are part of something. And I think this became particularly evident during the start of the pandemic, where people were stuck at home with their kids and they needed outdoor space. And
get me out.
Yeah, and I have no problem with a small bit of lawn turf for a typical home.
For a good game of croquet.
Yeah, but there are opportunities to think differently and to break conventions and to not get stuck in this cycle of petroleum, fossil fuel consumption to mow our yards every week, when there are other alternatives. Like, we do a lot of work with, like, one product in particular is a hybrid clover lawn, where we'll mix clover and fescue seed. And the idea behind this is that fescue spoon feeds off from the nitrogen nodules of the clover. It's a nitrogen fixer. So you already right off the bat don't have to fertilize your yard, and it only requires mowing like 3 to 5 times a season versus conventional turf, which is pretty much weekly, and it's a water suck. You know, it needs water. So these are the kinds of things that literally keep me up at night, like thinking about, well, gosh, if every property could commit to 10% or 20% of their property being managed or stewarded in a way that is working with plants of that place. Like, I'm not a purist, like, just to put it out there. Like, I'm a pragmatist. So I think it's worth looking at things that maybe for some reason the industry might have changed its tune over the years, related to climate change or related to even sourcing materials. Like, we live in a different time and place post-pandemic, and I think the time is ripe for creating a little bit more connection to context.
Yeah. We my wife chose the grass we would put in because she wanted the horses to be able to eat it.
Sure,
that we have for 2 months, 6 weeks each year, so she can just release them in the yard, and they kind of just go in a fan, and they just kind of trim it all down. It's like, oh, all right, that's good. And then we get fertilizer out of it. So, and then what they eat goes on the garden, and then it goes back. It works well.
Now you just need goats.
I definitely am considering goats for areas below our lawn that we groved the trees, but the forest floor didn't stay like blueberries and wintergreen. It kind of started getting grasses growing up and stuff. And I don't want to have to mow it every year and all that, because it's already very rocky field. It's not something you can mow as easily. So we either have to take the whole thing down, plant something like wildflowers and mow it, like twice a year or something. That's one thought. I would like to do it kind of how they do in London. We found that it was an interesting thing where they'd mow the edges of things and they'd let the center grow out. And to the American aesthetic, you're like, what is wrong with the city of London that they're not mowing there? And then you look and you're like, oh yeah, no, it's a border. Well, and it's a lot better for the insects and everything,
absolutely.
I imagine.
And this is actually one of the main reasons why I felt particular conviction to come back to practice in Maine, because I've watched, when I first went to college, the profession of landscape architecture in my mind was sort of an emerging profession here in the state of Maine. And I think as I've gotten to be more comfortable with my role in the profession and the opportunities within the profession, I see that the way that we think about maintenance and land management, that we've actually been really smart in Maine about curating our landscapes, particularly from an agricultural and productive standpoint. And it honestly kills me when I look at new landscapes that are going in that are trying to mimic like the suburban cookie cutter vibe that you see in a lot of the suburbs outside of, or pretty much anywhere, right?
Yeah.
And so I think Maine has an opportunity as it develops, particularly in rural places, to avoid going in that direction. We don't need to irrigate vast areas of lawn. We don't need to mow every inch of our properties. There's an inherent sense of place that comes from letting things be a little bit more wild and fallow in many cases. So it's another thing that really drew me to working here.
Yeah, I haven't really thought about that all that much, but Maine isn't a huge subdivision place like Texas and
Right.
I
Yep.
mean, if you drive from the west into Phoenix, you're just pure desert, and then all of a sudden it's just a wall. Like it's desert,
And
full
it's
on.
totally related to the irrigation stopping,
And
right?
it's just
Yeah.
all of a sudden it's a wall with a subdivision inside.
Yep.
And on the other side is vast desert, and you just up against it, and all of a sudden it's just cookie cutter house after house
Yep.
and irrigation and all the thing. It's just crazy.
Well, it really makes you question in a broader context, like what is land ownership? Like what does that mean? And how do we as people live a little bit more lightly in the places that we're living? And
Yeah.
I think that we're fortunate that the damage hasn't been done to much of Maine. And
Yeah.
as we're watching this, there's a tremendous migration of population. Baby boomers are moving north. There's a quality of life here that I think is very different from other places in New England. And so I think with that comes an expectation of everything's going to be cultivated and clipped and managed in a way that just
Welcome to
doesn't,
Maine.
yeah, it doesn't work. Like we both know, like just the insects alone in Maine
Yeah.
are vast and voracious and hungry, and so those are the kinds of things that get me excited.
I love that about Maine, that a few times I've been at jobs in Boston and people are like, why do you live in Maine? And as soon as they ask that question, you don't have to do anything other than like, well, you're not going to get the explanation. But
Right.
if you were to drive home with me tonight, and as I go up my driveway, it's dark, it's quiet, and I only hear
Yeah.
peepers.
Yeah,
There's
the
no,
peepers.
and it's
The lightning
like,
bugs.
and you see some lightning bugs.
Hear
It's
an
just
owl.
calm. It's beautiful, and it's not all the other things that is fun about working in the city. I like that energy, and I like to experience it for a moment. But my place of calm and home, Maine is just so much better. But yeah, we came here in the early 2000s, and it's such a drastic change even in Biddeford since then. The entire state is experiencing an influx. So it's good to see that people that are from here are picking up on that and hopefully getting ahead of that snowball that's,
And our homes are sanctuaries, no matter how you look at it. And I think that was demonstrated pretty significantly during the pandemic.
Yeah.
And now that we're in this place where there is an influx of new people moving into the state, I think it's reasonable that landscape professionals, architects, engineers, that we're kind of in charge of making sure that we don't mess this up.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a place where everyone that's interested in this field or that's growing into this realm of the profession has an opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
It's a very, very important one, in my opinion. Next question. On August 4th, your firm will be 20. What's the date today?
Today's the 31st.
Oh,
so in
it's
5
coming
days.
up. All right.
Yeah.
All right. This will probably be out after August. Back in August 4th, your firm will be 20 years old. What have been some of your most rewarding experiences, and what challenges have you seen? And what lies ahead?
Well, I have to say that probably one of the most meaningful things for me has been the
Coming on this podcast. Sorry.
Yes,
What?
definitely.
No.
The connections that I've made with my client base.
Yeah.
It's been really meaningful to work with a lot of people who have, they've been patrons. They've been people that have seen both the art and the science that we're blending together as landscape architects. And I've had incredible opportunities to build really wonderful landscapes in lots of very cool, special places.
Yeah.
I think I'm incredibly fortunate to have found a career that allows me to kind of step both into my creative side and also into my more ecological mind. And so that has been an incredible experience. And also, I have to be totally honest and say that one of the most exciting parts of running my business is seeing how my team grows and thrives and watching them unlock opportunities in their careers. And that's just been a really wild experience.
How many employees do you have?
So we're up to close to 30.
Oh, wow.
And we've got 6 people in the Portland office, and everyone else is down in the Boston office.
What are your top tips for managing people?
I couldn't tell you, man. It's a hard one. Like, you have to listen. You have to understand that these are human beings with individual needs. And I think that nurturing that is really important, especially in the environment where we are still a hybrid office. We never went back full time to working in a conventional office setting.
Right.
And so we allow a lot of flexibility because we recognize that there's got to be a life-work balance. And I feel really proud that our firm has committed to sustaining that. No one in our office works more than, say, a 45-hour week. We have a lot of good benefits and paid time off and holidays and such. And, I'll also say that in the big picture, like, staffing an office is also one of the biggest challenges, right? You've got to find the right people to feel like they belong and are part of a group or a team. And I think also some of it comes down to, as landscape architects, there's a finite pool of landscape architects available to hire. And so it's a challenge to staff, especially in Maine, because there aren't a lot of landscape architects here. And the ones that are here are pretty happy with their jobs,
right,
their teams. So I'll also say that another challenge in the past 20 years is I now feel that 2 decades in, I've actually been able to watch the changes in our climate and in our ecosystems to know
Maine feels different
Maine
from when I
feels
first
different.
moved here,
It
which
does.
is saying a lot. That's not
really-
very long.
It really is.
Climate-wise, like
Climate-wise, like, I can remember growing up. I mean, I sound like back in my day.
Back in our day,
But I can remember snowstorms that we literally would have to dig out from for days.
Yeah.
3 feet was not unusual in the Bucksport area. And I never knew growing up what an invasive plant was. I never saw anything but unspoiled, untamed nature.
right.
And now I see every invasive species. I see it from both plant and insect communities. We have wildfires and tornadoes in Maine. We have hurricanes. Like, all the things that used to sound kind of far off and exotic are now here.
Right.
And I think this past winter was a particularly scary one for a lot of Mainers, especially
wasn't a
folks
winter,
that lived on
hardly.
the coast. It was like 60 degrees at some points during the winter. And the frost wasn't in the ground.
Which in some ways is just great news.
I know, right? There's
But-
that part of you that wants to be like, okay, I can get used to this.
This isn't Georgia.
England,
What's going on?
But then there's the other side where, from a business perspective, it's kind of amazing that we're now in Maine doing construction on landscapes year round. That was unheard of even in Massachusetts 10 years ago.
Whoa.
And now we're building landscapes 24/7. So it does change the approach to a project. And but I'll tell you, that's probably one of my most nerve-wracking, scariest things to think about is we're setting the bars to adapt to these 100-year storms. And just day before yesterday, there was a storm in Vermont that was 1 in a 1,000-year storm. And you're hearing about these, like, epic rainfall and wind patterns. And, as an educator, I preach the fact that our forests and our plant communities are under constant assault by weather.
Yeah.
And when you throw in, like, here in Maine, like, the emerald ash borer is going to cause tremendous damage to the ash tree communities.
Yeah.
The beech leaf disease is all over the coast of Maine now. So, places that are very much embedded in our heart and souls and that really create and evoke that character of place, they're changing rapidly.
Yeah.
And when they die, other plant communities will set in, as you know. So
I mean, I owned 2 rental units over here on Elm Street. Mm-hmm. There's no elms left.
Sure. Oh, yeah, the elm is
Dutch elm.
great American, like, that whole rise and fall of the elm tree, that and the American chestnut and our sugar maples are at risk. We're going to be looking at a very different landscape in another decade, and 25 years from now, Maine is going to have a very different sense of place.
Are elms coming back at all in Maine?
There are elms. The seed bank, that's part of what's awesome about the science behind soil structures is that every time that a plant dies in a forest, then all the seed bank is exposed to sun and to moisture. And so there are plenty of instances where the seed bank is allowing or has this seeds in it that are rejuvenating, but it's a dog eat dog world out there. Like the food web is real, and things eat. It's a process of life and decay and everything in between. And so I think the scariest thing that I've seen, especially seeing the past 20 years unfold in my career, is that a lot of these plant communities are monocultures that are infilling these more biodiverse spaces or second generation woodlands. And so you see like, these massive tangles of multiflora rose and bittersweet vine and tree of heaven. And, all of this stuff is changing not just character of place, but it deeply influences the kinds of animals and kind of habitat that exists in these pieces of land. So even more reason why I think the cumulative impacts of what I do and what our profession does are extremely important to keep in front and center right now.
How do you feel about Japanese knotweed?
This is where I love the history behind Japanese knotweed, that like it was cut up and brought from Asia as ballast material for the shipping for way back in
ballast material.
Like they would put it in the bottom of ships to help them
just as weight
from tipping over when they were coming from Asia to the United States. They'd dump it out on the river banks and it would float up river, and they would fill their coffers with whatever they were getting, whether it be timber or anything, like potatoes. And so Japanese knotweed took hold in a lot of very sensitive riparian areas, like river corridors and waterfronts. It's edible. And it, like, one thing that I think is really, like, whoever's listening to this from a business development idea, like, there are byproducts and products that can be made from these plant species. And I think it's important to explore that.
Yeah.
Japanese knotweed is edible. Maybe there's some sort of way to control the soil conditions that they're growing in and to actually harvest it and make something of it. But again, this is where, like, I think Maine is filled with innovators, and I love that Yankee pioneering spirit where, like, no one tells you no. You go out and figure out how to make it work.
Work with what you got.
That's right.
My wife hates Japanese knotweed.
Yeah,
like if she sees it on the side of the road, she just growls at us as we drive by. But that, and are you pro or con the New England beach roses?
I have an affinity for them. I think they're beautiful. I also understand that they're replacing really, like, irreplaceable habitat and pristine coastal plant communities. So I've seen what it's done on Cape Cod, because I do a lot of work out in that neck of the woods. So I don't think there's any way to eradicate it, but I think that we should not be planting it.
Where is it from?
The Rugosa rose?
Yeah.
It was one of those plants that was introduced early on as a domestic species. People love roses, right? And now whenever I see Rugosa rose, I just think of, like, them covered in Japanese beetles and, like, doing that dance, like they're moving, not because the wind is moving, but because they're covered in larvae. And but it is, this is what's also hard about practicing and preaching this at the same time about what you do. Again, I said I'm not a purist, but I do believe in removing invasive plant colonies and trying to replace them with materials that are going to support biodiversity and habitat. But, like, in Cambridge, for example, where you have a tree community that is part of the fabric of that place, and it's helping with reducing heat island effect, and it's really contributing to shading our places. And it's hard to advocate to a client to take down a 100-year-old Norway maple tree that is releasing a toxin into the soil and actually making it almost impossible for other plants to grow beneath it. And you're also knowing that a much reduced number of species of insects can thrive and survive off from the foliage
of a
compared
Norway
to a
maple.
red maple or sugar maple. So
interesting.
It's really like, a lot of these systems, these plant communities were left unchecked for a long time. We didn't know. Like, we did not understand, I think, in the post World War II building boom, what it meant to plant a plant from another place and what that could eventually do to the ecosystem. And so I think I have a lot of appreciation for towns and municipalities and communities that try to target invasive species and try to come up at least with strategies for how to manage and replace those. But again, the pragmatic side in my head says, well, gosh, if that plant is surviving there in the face of all these crazy storms and wind patterns and everything else, like maybe there's a hybrid, maybe. But yeah, it's a hard one to answer directly, right? Because
I mean, what is really invasive? If it got there, it got there, and it's surviving. So
there are all kinds of philosophies and conversations going on about assisted migration and whether or not we as human beings should be actively doing that. And you know, oftentimes I'll get asked to look at a project that is restorative in nature. And I always have to ask myself and the clients, like, what are we restoring it to? What era? What time and place?
How many centuries?
Is it pre-European colonial settlement? Is it indigenous people that we're trying to create, like the exact same atmosphere? Post-apocalypse, post-pandemic,
asteroid impact, post-glacial.
And that's where I think we have to get a little bit more have a reality check about what is possible, because we aren't going to eradicate Japanese knotweed on the coast of Maine. We're going to have to embrace in places that maybe there is some value to it. Like maybe it's preventing erosion, or maybe it's helping storm surge or preventing storm surge from really wiping out a mud flat or something. But you know, this is why I think context matters, and understanding, like, as sea level rises and as plant communities change and soil erodes, we have the tools in our toolkit to make informed decisions. But a lot of time it comes down, it's often politicized, and it becomes a cost thing in our municipal places. So I think, again, it comes back down to opportunities and making sure we explore and educate our patrons and make sure that people are hearing that and willing to invest in preserving places or rejuvenating places with good plant communities.
Right. That's an interesting way to think about it. Like, what are we rejuvenating back to? How far back are we going to say this is original and that's good?
Absolutely.
And then, how you execute that. And I mean, I imagine you're trending as a more organic type person rather than introducing a bunch of refined chemicals and everything else.
Yeah, definitely. I'm doing this. I've experimented on this at my own home, and it's true that my lawn does not look like a pristine emerald golf course lawn. Sure. I have a clover lawn. It's filled with weeds. But I also can go out there any time of the day and find a dozen frogs and snakes, and I have lightning bugs in my yard, and that's in Massachusetts. And so I really think that, again, I keep saying this purist versus pragmatism thing. Like, I really feel that there's a time and place for everything, but it can't be that everyone's just blasting glyphosate across ditches throughout Maine. Like, that's going to completely erode an entire system of habitat and builds up. We've learned there are consequences to that kind of thinking.
Yeah. All right. Many of your gardens integrate native plants and feature artful hardscape designs that feature reclaimed salvaged materials, one of which I photographed out on Sebago. Where do you draw your inspiration from? So,
as I said at the start here, the places we're from really shape who we are. And so I grew up Bucksport, and going and walking through Fort Knox as a kid, which is just these incredible, like, feats of masonry, like giant blocks of granite and brickwork and vaults and arches, and then you juxtapose that to the more rustic side of Acadia, where the carriage trails have these beautiful old bridges and things that were really carefully considered and of a material of a place. And so that was a big part of my inspiration, or it continues to be. And I think a lot of our work kind of spans that modern rustic modern sort of vibe. But again, with this sort of environmental or eco mindset that I've had over my life, Waste not, want not, to me is a big thing to consider. And so with reclaimed materials, like reclaimed granite has become such an incredibly popular material because it's beautiful. It has a patina. It's often 6 inches thick, so it doesn't heat up the same way that a thinner material does. So it's helping on some level with heat island effect to diminish it. But the real reason that I started using it was that when you have stone fabricated, you're basically working with a quarry to fabricate that material, whether it be through conventional saws, stone saws, or things that are all petroleum and fossil fuel consuming to create and fabricate the stone. So I started thinking of it as a way to kind of help reduce carbon footprint and to think about like in the supply chain, if I'm specifying reclaimed granite that was a curb in a parking lot or in an old downtown area, like I believe there's a lot of energy in stone and wood, and I love that you can kind of borrow that language and create something new out of it and be adaptive with these materials. So it's something I've been pretty passionate about, and we're really, like, as our firm has grown and that material has become more and more popular, it pushes us as a firm and as landscape architects to continue being innovative. Like, how can we, what's the next reclaimed granite? What's the next material that we can use and really embed into our landscapes?
I like that. The place we photographed out on Sebago is just so pretty. The repetition and the lines and the stairway down to the water and everything. That whole project was like, oh, reclaimed granite.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
It's also like, I'm a barefoot person. I love to be outdoors with no shoes on, and like walking on a hut, bluestone or concrete patio on an 80-degree day, your feet are going to get scorched. I can walk out in full sun on a granite terrace and my feet aren't, blistering hot.
Yeah.
It's little anecdotal things like that again, going back to this cumulative impact concept, I think we have opportunities to try to be smarter about the materials we're specifying. And I also love the idea, again, of having a piece of history embedded in a landscape that we create, that you kind of bringing new life into something.
Yeah, especially if you know where they've like the town, or it's like, yeah, this was in the mill in Rumford, and
totally.
Yeah, that's a cool thing.
Yep.
In 2022, you created MCLD Land Lab, or at MCL Land Lab for Instagram.
Yep.
A research and experimentation farm located here in Arundel, right next door.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about the farm, and what role will it play in the future of your practice?
Great
and
question.
Can I come and visit?
Yeah, absolutely, man.
Okay, good.
So
with my family.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, good.
So
Land Lab.
Start of before the pandemic, actually, we were looking for a property where we could, frankly, roll up our sleeves and get dirty and do cool things with soil and plant experiments.
So this is essentially a lab.
It is,
where you're working through different.
It's not like a conventional scientific lab in any way. It's more of a it's an experimentation plot. So we found this property. I found it. It actually went on the market on like a Friday night, and I had a signed purchase and sale agreement by Monday morning because I just saw it and was like, "This is
That's it."
And it's a 12.5 acre old equestrian farm in Arundel, and I bought it from a family who was running a boarding operation there for horses. And over the years, they had about 12 or 15 grazing paddocks, and the paddocks had been just gnawn down to the nub from overgrazing. Mm-hmm. And I saw that as a starting point and thought, well, this is a challenge. Like, how are we going to rehabilitate this landscape and make it something that can support greater biodiversity, or what do we have to work with? So we bought it.
So is that not good for it to be chewed down that much, even with the horses pooping in there and putting it back in?
Not over and over and over again. Like, there has to be a period where you rotate paddocks so that the plant material can survive and
kind of throw down roots and grow up.
Exactly.
And back then.
Yep.
Okay.
And horses, they have, I mean, their hooves are pretty wide and flat, and so they do aerate the soil to some extent, but they also compact it pretty significantly. So
soil compaction is an issue.
It's a big deal. So over the past 2+ years, we've been going through a process of letting this. We're doing a big renovation of the property, and we tore down, unfortunately, this cool old farmhouse that was filled with mold, and we've rehabilitated an indoor riding arena that is basically going to serve as a gathering pavilion for my firm and for events that we'll have and for connecting to the community. And but the big thing that we've been doing is learning to steward this piece of land and letting it go through a period of fallowness and watching the successional plant community come back to life. Like we have tremendous numbers of native plant materials that, again, were grazed right down to the ground, but not grazing for the past 3 seasons. We now have great big stands of goldenrod and Joe Pye weed and like lots of beautiful grasses. And so we, at the start of, right after we bought it, we set up wildlife cameras pretty strategically around the perimeter of the farm.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the @MCLD Land Lab, which is our address on social media. And we started sharing how the life is coming back onto this property through a stewardry process. We're seeing tremendous flocks of migratory birds that are, that part of Arundel sticks right out into the ocean with Kennebunkport. And so we're part of the migratory bird patterns. We're watching reptiles and amphibians come back into play, tons of deer and coyote. And I just think it's fascinating. Like, we don't, in most of the suburban landscapes, really acknowledge the wildlife community that lives there, that's been there for thousands of years before us, and that they coexist with us. And so these wildlife cams have shown us and demonstrated that these systems are there at night. We might not see it because we're tucked away in bed. So for my team, it's been a really cool way to start investigating, like, how can we support these a greater biodiversity and more habitat conditions for the species we're seeing. And at the same time, it's just fun, man. It's like really cool to just watch and observe how a place kind of changes and how quickly it changes. And I think as we expand our footprint onto that property, the idea is that we will have a couple of greenhouses, and we're hoping to be able to, like you were talking about transplanting small pines from one place in your yard to another. We're hoping to be able to gather plants from our projects in advance of construction and to propagate them and to replace them back on site afterwards, thinking that, if you start looking at the genetics of a plant and think about the goldenrod that's growing in Arundel might be genetically different from the one that's growing up in Aroostook County or that's maybe growing in Connecticut. And there's a certain viability and nourishing cycle that happens with particular plants and insects. And so we're hopeful that we can continue investigating this and seeing, like, well, maybe there are opportunities here to start harvesting plants from on site and to not be part of the conventional nursery industry. Like, maybe there are other ways to do things. And that's always been part of what drives me. Like, I like to think outside the box, and I like to see innovation. And sometimes there are miserable failures, and that comes with the territory. So who knows?
Pretty
what this
excited
becomes.
about your miserable failure.
Yeah.
So can people like set up an appointment and come by, or is
we're
it
not
just
we're not open to the public at all
Okay.
yet. We are right now we're in build mode, so we're kind of letting this property tell us what needs to happen.
So you're kind of letting it lie fallow and seeing how it comes back.
And managing. So I'm actively, like, I've established mowing patterns, and I'm working on removing like glossy buckthorn and all the invasives.
That glossy buckthorn.
Yep. And
What is that?
It's an invasive understory tree.
Understory tree?
It's an incredibly aggressive and prolific plant that takes over thickets and kind of wet areas.
Oh,
And so
okay.
you'll see a field. 1 year it's a field. 3 years later, it can literally be 6 feet tall of glossy buckthorn. So, so part of what my hope with this property is that it becomes a place that allows me and my team to run experiments and to think about different plant communities and associations and assemblages, and perhaps it'll be a place where I can hold symposia and lectures for the broader landscape architecture community, or even the design community. Like, again, it's lofty, Trent. Like, I don't mean to make it sound bigger than what it is, but I think that, you know, part of what drives me is being part of a community and being part of something that's moving the needle forward. And this property could have been bought and subdivided into 6 house lots, and what a shame. Like, we're watching these rural agricultural parcels that were such a staple and such a part of the atmosphere of southern Maine and now down east Maine. They're getting snapped up, developed, and sold into single house lots. So I hope that there's some real value down the road to how this property is seen as one contiguous parcel. So it's been a really fun, meaningful project. And there's nothing like riding on a tractor on a hot summer day and just being out there in the field. It's really fun.
Well, we have land in a similar area out towards the coast in southern Biddeford, which is kind of, you know, and we got 12 to 14 acres, depending on what 1840 to 1920, you know.
Yeah.
But
like, what is it? Rods and rocks, and there's a branch on a tree that marks the property line.
Yeah. The stream here and the beaver dam there. And my wife's been very much in line with kind of what you're saying, like no invasive species, don't bring any dirt onto the property. And we've been trying to mostly do all of our landscaping and everything with existing materials on the site, which has been a struggle, but also been kind of fun. I appreciate it. But that's really interesting what you're doing with the land lab. That any help you might need from any talent that we have or can provide, we'd be happy to work with you on that, because that's really interesting. I think there's a massive movement towards sustainability of food. Like, currently
100%.
our food supply coming from so far away at all times is really dangerous for one.
It's easy in this time and place to be overconsumptive and to just be like, oh, it's January and I'm going to buy these heirloom tomatoes because, oh my God, they're delicious and I can buy them. Exactly. And then you start wasting or continue this cycle of wasting. And we will, you know, I have one aspiration that the food scarcity and where our food comes from is a really critically important thing for all of us to keep in mind. And so one of our goals is to establish a huge vegetable garden at the farm that I would love for my team to be able to harvest from anything they want, right? But at the end of the year, we're imagining, like, maybe there's an opportunity to donate the food somewhere. And, like, I think, again, it's lofty, but I feel like there are moments with this particular piece of property that we can use it to really advance people's connections to the land. And that to me is like number one. Let's see how we can make a 7-year-old connect to, like, seeing how food is grown, or how a plant that goes into their yard is grown, and what kind of relationships other species have to it, and how does that make us feel, and how does it make us connect to a place. So pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah, I have this idea that it seems like some percentage of our food should be grown and not transported more than a certain amount of miles. Like, as a policy, like, okay, make it more expensive for us, but also create the business opportunities to produce that food locally. And then there's the trapped market, in a sense. Now, I don't like a lot of government oversight in the least, but we've got such a top-heavy population dependent on these supply chains that are just as thin as a road or a railroad or semi-truck to a foreign country that just are 100%. Drastically dangerous to have that
our infrastructure just isn't there to support.
It's driven by profit and profit only.
It really is. And it needs, like, I'll be honest, I think profit is a good thing. I think for a lot of
But you also
in a lot
have to
of
cut
conditions.
profit to ensure consistency of profit at some point.
You can't make insane profit every single year and not invest that back into your community or back into your team and expect that you're going to be able to sustain any operation. It's just not possible.
Yeah. Yeah. That, I hope we can get back to more of that. Do you know Noah Wentworth and Frinkle Pod Farm?
I don't know, but I should. Sounds
like
I should.
Well, he's also a contractor. He built our house, and we went with him because he's completely on board with, like, he probably wouldn't take a project unless it philosophically, meshed with his ideas. But he runs Frinkle Pod Farm, it's an organic farm down in Kennebunkport, Arundel area.
Jeez, that's right in my neck of the woods. Yeah.
Yeah, no, he's a really nice guy, really good at what he does, both building and farming. It's right on. Do you know where the flea market is?
Yeah, totally.
And Bentley's just past it. So if you pass the flea market heading towards Bentley's, but turn immediately before, at that stoplight, just down that road about a mile on the right is Frinkle Pod Farm.
Right.
So you should go check it out sometime. That's awesome. They've got a whole farm stand and then kind of teaching building and everything along with it. And it's a really interesting business model and super friendly, talented guy, Noah. So you might be able to sit and chat with him for a while and enjoy it. So thank you for doing Land Lab. That's super cool. And follow up with me sometime. I'd love to come and see it. Like when you're there someday and you want to talk to people about what you love, let me know. And
absolutely.
We'd come by. So
we can geek out over it. It's fun.
My wife will mostly geek over it. I'll be in the back slightly rolling my eyes because I'm just
you'll
thinking
have your
about
camera
the things.
Taking amazing photos of
there
the
we
place.
go. I like that. All right. As an educator focused on sharing the world of plants and ecology in the built environment with young minds, can you give us a sense of what strategies you employ to inspire your students to go out into the world to do good?
Yeah.
Good being a relative term.
But I take this I didn't ever picture that I would be in academia in this capacity. I've always enjoyed learning. And I have to say, first and foremost, like I learn from my students as much as I teach them, if not more. And I take it incredibly seriously that I'm in charge of introducing them to plants and ecology in our profession. And I've said this many times, but I feel that landscape architecture has the power to help save the world. I really do.
I'd agree with that.
And it's incredibly meaningful to have conversations with people who are they're being enlightened every day to the world around them in different ways, and they're learning to look at things in different ways and to understand systems and reciprocities and synergies. And for me, as an educator who focuses on teaching people plants and plant communities and ecologies, I take my students out into the field. So I take them to Mount Auburn Cemetery, just outside of Boston. We go to the Arnold Arboretum. We go to Harvard Yard and walk through these landscapes. And I point out species and relationships between species. And we look at landform and soils and hydrology and all these things.
The relationship between species is really interesting.
It's amazing. And we've barely begun to understand that from a human level. It's always, we've seen, we combat nature rather than embrace it more often than not. And so I think in a lot of ways, I'm trying to help create an ethic for people that really respects those relationships. Before we blast through them, let's learn about them and see if there's a way to incorporate them or to enhance them. And the way that I find valuable in teaching this is to be out in the field and to draw and to take photos and to touch things and to smell things. Like it's a tangible experience. And like I do a lot of exercises with students where we literally draw plant notes, and they have to draw parts of plants and take notes and write their observations down. And the idea is that in the end, they're going to have a little compendium or an encyclopedia of plants that they learned here in New England. And maybe they'll learn a methodology for how to learn plants wherever they end up. And to me, that also is a way to kind of keep working locally, keep working within the plant communities that you end up living in, rather than importing a rose from Alabama into Bucksport, Maine. Like, that doesn't make sense from a carbon footprint standpoint, from a sustainability standpoint. So mentoring and teaching and being part of that that community has been an incredibly meaningful experience for me. And I think it's, in a lot of ways, I think it's elevated our firm, and it's given a lot of opportunities for us to kind of think abstractly, not always get stuck in just the one way of doing things. Like, there are a lot of ways to do things. So
here's a tough question for you.
Yeah.
Your favorite plant and why?
Well,
The
it's
why
funny.
is the
I have an
interesting
answer
part.
for this because my favorite plant is Amelanchier, which is the shadblow serviceberry tree.
Doesn't make it any clearer for me.
Yeah, well, it's an understory tree, meaning you have oaks and maples that are canopy trees, and then you have trees that are a little bit shorter and sort of on the edges and kind of like live beneath the canopy.
Yep.
That plant is incredibly versatile. It can grow in a lot of different soil typologies and hydrologies, and it has incredible multi-seasonal value. So it blooms in here in Maine. It blooms in like late April into May. White paper, beautiful white flowers. It produces a fruit that's like literally looks like a blueberry. It's edible. It's not the tastiest. Like, it's not like a blueberry. It's a little bit bitter.
But if you're dying,
Yeah, if you're dying, well, you can definitely eat it if you put enough sugar in. But here's the thing that I love about it: it is providing tremendous amounts of ecosystem support. So you have insects and birds that are feeding on the nectar in the spring that are pollinating this plant, and then I know when the cedar waxwing birds are coming to my property down in Massachusetts, because they've learned that I have 3 Amelanchier trees, and they show up right as the fruit is ripening. So like, that's part of when I was talking earlier about connecting people with place. There are rhythms and systems and fluctuations within seasonality that we can totally build into our landscapes that connect people with those rhythms, and it's almost like a heartbeat. You can watch it happen.
it's so cool to be able to identify and in a way sync up with. Like, oh, Matthew told me about this. Yeah, fine. Come spring, you're like, oh, look at the waxwing, and he's and then you start to live in that rhythm and notice it, rather than what's the next dopamine, what's the next,
Yeah, and
that's really interesting.
What I'm excited about is, like, again, thinking about all 4 seasons of the year and looking at plant communities that are going to be resilient within the pressures that we face with changing climate. And so I think more now than ever, we need to be planting materials that are going to produce nourishment for migrating birds and insects, and really thinking carefully about how to be supporting the ecosystem in its context as well. And this also plays into like thinking about water quality and thinking about erosion. Like, I tend to plant a lot of plants in our landscapes that have very fibrous root systems. Like, almost think of it as like super dense capillaries that are spreading throughout the soil. And part of that is that it helps prevent erosion. It sustains the soil elevation. And so I think there are a lot of plants like that grow naturally in Maine that could be harvested and contribute to preservation of place and insect and animal communities. And so I know other landscape architects are doing this. They're inspired by this. And I think it needs to extend more than just the professional services arena, right? It needs to be that typical homeowner can see something on my MCLD Land Lab Instagram profile and say, "Oh my God, I have high bush blueberry, and if I treat it a certain way, I might see cardinals feeding on it in July." Or
that's what I want to do. I want to come over and take a bunch of pictures for your Instagram profile. That'd be fun,
sweet.
Just to wander around and get cool.
Well, and the other thing about a farm like this is, I spent all my time growing up in down east, like where one minute the fog is thick as pea soup, as they say, and then in Arundel, like we're only 3 miles from the ocean. So any given point during the day, there might be a burst of fog and then followed up with dramatic sunsets. So the weather patterns there are pretty incredible. So I've really enjoyed getting to know that land in that capacity.
Oh, that's cool. My youngest son loves nature photography too. So he would be in tow looking for birds and stuff.
Nice.
That he's actually very talented. He's been getting a lot of really cool, like the baby turkeys that are running around right now.
They're so cute.
Like just tied in on them, and they're
The bunnies.
That's
But
super
that's
cool
see,
stuff.
that's like you're a good dad because you're educating your kids into an ethic that is working again with plants of a place, with animal communities of a place. Like I don't think like when we were growing up, I don't think that was a typical thing that people recognized. And so I have hope that your generation of parenting is going to create a different kind of person that hopefully has a stewardry ethic in mind, because land is not renewable, right?
No.
We know that as a fact. So we have a responsibility to educate kids now so that frankly they can have kids in the future and continue the pattern, right? So
Now, what do you think of the idea? I have a member of my family that is big into farming. He's looking for his own land to be like homestead, self-sustaining type. But he, because of a biblical principle, only wants to use a piece of land for 6 years and then wants to let it lie fallow for 1 year. And he follows that religiously. Like if he's working for someone who's owning a farm and it comes up, he won't work it that next year and he moves on. And he's not judgmental in what he does, but it's for him.
Sure.
He's very conscientious with himself, very liberal with others. Great guy. But does that make sense? Have you heard of this? Is it?
yeah, I think in conventional practices with farming, crop rotation is critically important because you can't take every bit of nourishment out of a piece of land and expect that it's always going to be a productive piece of land. So I think there's some common sense with that concept where if you buy a 10-acre piece of land and you intend to farm it, maybe you're only farming a few acres at a time and you're rotating, or you're thinking about, again, that landscape management and that stewardry concept, like letting places go fallow. And then like there's a whole movement right now about no-till, like using radishes and all these cool plants that naturally corkscrew into the soil and help create more friable conditions. And so I think that that's a place where, like, I don't cancel anything out because we like the world has become polarized enough. We don't need to like look at if someone's religious belief is requiring or is suggesting that they rotate their crops. Great. What can I learn from that? Like, I'm not a terribly religious person, but I'm spiritual, and I think there are places where we can all learn and adapt from each other, and that's kind of human nature, right? Like, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
So,
It seems to make sense to me that you're working soil, it's going to lose something, and especially if you're monocropping it, you're going to deplete a very specific line of elements and everything else.
Well, then, and there are assemblages of plant materials that can, like I mentioned, the fescue and clover sod combo. But there's the three sisters, like there's corn and beans and squash. Okay. And when you plant those together, they actually nourish each other and they produce higher yields. And so again, it kind of comes back to things that probably pre-colonial times, like we have, the Industrial Revolution kind of transformed the way that we farm and think about food production, and it's only gotten more and more mechanized and more monocultural, and like don't even get me started on like GMO soybean crops and the things that are like Roundup resistant. Like that stuff's terrifying to me.
Not to mention the litigious side of like our seed blew into your field and we have to cut all of your stuff.
Or our hives collapsed because the bees are eating pollen that isn't genetically nourishing to them. Like there's.
I just don't see how we're allowing this to go on. It seems like such a bad idea, but there's so much profit in it that.
Yeah, but that's the other thing too, is that like what I appreciate about Maine in particular is that it's your land and you get to do what you want with it. But I also feel like we have these opportunities to try to change the way that people think about using the land. And again, if we position it from a perspective that it is not renewable, not within our lifetimes anyway, that maybe that will help us reconsider some of the ways that we use the land and that we experience the land. Maybe not. I tend to be an optimist, and sometimes that gets me in trouble. But I feel like everyone has a different perspective, and that's kind of what makes the world tick. So,
well, I'm really interested in this land lab thing you have going on, because that's a great way of looking at we're studying and we're trying things here. Well, you got to make money off this right now. Like we eventually maybe, but right now the best idea is for us to see what's going on, see how this rejuvenates, see how we can influence it or negatively influence. Yep. That's a really interesting process.
There's nothing more powerful than getting to know a place before you even put a shovel in the ground. You can observe all the weather patterns and the cycles of a season. And, it's counter to what we typically want to do, is buy a piece of land and develop it and immediately move in and then figure out like where the sun is and all those things. But, this is what our ancestors did this for centuries, millennia. Like they moved according to the resources that were available and the exposure and the position of the sun. And so if we pay a little bit more attention to that, and guess what? I think we have to, and we're going to be forced to think about weather patterns and where we settle, because the reality is like the weather is going to dictate where we can maintain our settlements and maintain our communities. And
that's where going through places like Phoenix is just mind blowing.
Yeah,
it's like,
it is.
Do you guys, this is not sustainable.
It's not. But then you also look at the fact that these places have been thriving for century or decades at a minimum. And you have communities there. You have relationships and people that are embedded and built lives there, and they're part of the fabric. And it's really hard to be an outsider to judge a lot of the decisions of why people live in places they live in. And I always have to go back to like why is there mown grass on the desert? Why are we fertilizing the desert? Like why? It doesn't make sense to me. But people come to New England from the West Coast and they're like, there's too many trees. It's so claustrophobic. I'm like, yeah, but smell that air.
I agree with the too many trees and claustrophobic. I just the parts of Maine where it's a little bit of farming and you have a field where you can see, it's like, and I love that.
Yeah, that
like
expansiveness.
The New England farming, like just where you can see, I just love that. And I wish like 90% of the trees weren't here, but that's a pipe dream to like, okay, then the quality of air goes down and I get it.
And, again, in that same spirit of the places we're from shaping who we are, like in down East Maine, the lowbush blueberry crops are the dominant agricultural condition, right?
Yep.
Everywhere you go, there's a bright red blueberry field in late fall. And I look at that and think, if we don't continue to maintain that, it changes tourism. It changes the entire relationship that people have to that parcel of land. You turn your back on that for 10 or 15 years, and it turns into a young forest.
Oh, yeah.
And so that sort of cycle is, I think, especially in Maine, as the agricultural communities have diminished and have downsized, and there's a whole shifting priority of how people live on the land, we're watching the rebirth of these second generation, third generation forests. And it's going to, again, it kind of plays back into a very different landscape ahead of us. And I think that also means that there are different animal communities and pollinator communities that are going to thrive in those conditions, and others will cancel out. And that's also, like, there's a really awesome paleoecologist who is a professor at the University of Maine, Dr. Jacqueline Gill. And I saw her speak. She's spoken in a couple of my classes, and she's always struck me as someone who is also very pragmatic. And she said, species migration is a feature, not a flaw. And that stuck with me because it's 100% accurate. Like, animals will find a way, plants will find a way. And it's just oftentimes we approach stewardry and management from a purely aesthetic perspective rather than looking at what's actually in front of us, like what systems are at play. And that's
the complete picture.
Exactly.
The aesthetics are what's on the surface, and they're very important.
They are, but we also, like, why is one thing deemed beautiful and who deemed it that way, right?
People who came up with the plants
GMO
that are on the weed list.
Right.
Well, why is that a weed? Like, can you define that for me? Like, what defines a weed?
I mean, I think a weed is a plant that will invade a natural plant system or a plant community, like something that is prolific and takes over and becomes a dominant
So
species.
not just out of place, one that can attack and take over.
Yeah, I should think about that. I'm sure there's a scientific definition for
Some
it,
people might say the America of the world.
Oh gosh.
Let's not get political. Yeah. If you're too, it's like colonization.
Yeah,
Plant colonization in a way.
Plant colonization is a real thing. It's happening in front of our eyes, and that's what's kind of wild is that I can look back at, I'm 46, I can look at what's happened in my lifetime, and I can think about the anecdotes that my grandparents told me about their farm, and the plant communities are vastly different from what they experienced when they were younger, and your kids are going to grow up and have a very different experience as well, and that's part of. I think it's a normal part of, of a place, right? To watch it evolve, but some of it comes down to how is it being curated and who's managing it, and what are the dominant systems that are being preserved or maintained or acknowledged.
Right.
And oftentimes, they're not being acknowledged at all. They're just it's a piece of land. It's a square, man. There's no, like, I love to think about our projects without property lines. Like, how is that parcel part of a bigger network?
Yeah, because, I mean, animals, they just do not respect property lines. Yeah. And we let that
outrageous,
go.
Isn't it?
So you can have a bear, like, walk in and through your property line. You're like, oh, look at the bear. But if there's a human walking behind, you're like, get out of here!
Well, it's like, habitat encroachment is real, and the predator and prey ratios are completely off in so many communities, and like people are still poisoning mice and rats, and it's part of the food web. Like a hawk is not going to know if a chipmunk ate a poisoned piece of grain, right? So this stuff's real. You know, there are many people who preceded us who knew these as facts, like Silent Spring by, I think it's Rachel Carson. Like we know that there are chemicals, forever chemicals, that are in the land that are going to rear up, and you know, Maine is susceptible to it. Yeah. It's very much present. So
what is the best way to keep chipmunks out of my barn and mice without poisoning them to feed the
little
hawks?
Kitty cat. That's probably the best way to do it.
I keep saying that. I need a serial killer.
You need a Maine Coon cat.
Yeah. All right, last question for you here. How will climate adaptation play a role in your work as your firm continues to create resilient landscapes that rise to the challenges posed by the climate crisis here in New England? I think I'm going to need to get new glasses here soon. It's getting harder and harder.
You know, climate adaptation is it's embedded in the profession of landscape architecture. It's been embedded in landscape architecture for a long time. And I think as stewards and as people who are trusted with protecting the environment, that we have to pay attention to the systems that are around us, which also means thinking about how we maintain or manage or steward those systems, which I mentioned earlier, the clover lawn. Like, I mow my lawn 4, maybe 5 times a year. That's a massive reduction in carbon consumption, right? I'm not going to the gas station. I mow it with an electric mower. So there's one thing.
We got one of them.
I do with native plants. Often you're working with plants that are acclimated to the weather conditions of a place. So you're not putting things on life support by putting an irrigation system that is running 24/7. I believe in supplemental irrigation to get plants established, but we recommend that after a garden is in its 2nd or 3rd season, that irrigation is tweaked way down. Like, we don't need to over irrigate. I think that the adaptive reuse aspect of the reclaimed granite, working with FSC certified woods wherever we possibly can for fencing and frankly, working with materials that are as local as possible rather than specifying granite that's sourced from Switzerland or from China, or like, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And so everything that I'm observing is telling me you have to invest in climate forward thinking in design at all levels. And that extends to domestic and commercial places. It extends at all ages. Like, we have to think smarter and live more lightly on the land. And I think that, as you were saying, we were talking about earlier about food, like, where is our food coming from, and how can our domestic landscapes help support that? Like, one of the anecdotes about our farm is that we've done some internal competitions. Like, we've actually had teams of our employees get together and literally do research projects and present them to one another as inspiration and as an idea for thinking outside the box. And one of them is a food lab. So we had a 4-person team that went out and picked edible plant materials from the farm and created like a cool cocktail out of multiflora rose, and did we had a cookie that was made out of a fruit. Like, I think we have opportunities to be more connected to the places that we live in. And I hope that as my firm continues to grow and evolve, that we can do that in a way that is respectful to not just the land, but the animal communities and plant communities that are there, but also, like, again, really lofty and aspirational. Like, climate change is real. It's happening. We know it's happening. It's happening everywhere. And we have to think forward about that and be adaptive and do our best to try to prevent places that we love from disappearing.
Right. Well, Matthew Cunningham, thank you so much for sharing all this information, because it's, as someone who is in the sense of a hobby, kind of like looking up and like, all right, this guy does that, I'll try this, I'll do that. It's been really fun developing land in a conscientious way, to try and not just like, all right, cut the whole thing down, plant grass, and put a rhododendron here and there. And to more scalpel it into the forest. And the contractors that put our driveway in, we built into a forest. They called it the goat path, because my wife wanted to keep trees like right up to the thing, so
it's like surgery.
Very much so, until you're trying to get a camper in and out. So that can be difficult. But yeah, it's been really fun and really interesting. It's a lot of maintenance to upkeep, which I'm not great at, but my wife loves it. So hopefully we continue to work out finding a balance in doing what we're doing. But it's really interesting to talk to you about this, to expand the horizon. Have you watched the New England Forest Forensics?
No. It sounds
Dude,
like that.
There's this guy who, at the beginning of the video, I'll send you a link to it. At the beginning of the video, he goes into how Merino wool and everything came to the U.S. from Portugal or Spain, wherever it was, because they had a civil war and they had not an embargo, but they wouldn't let any of these specific sheep out of the country because they had merino. Mm-hmm. But then they broke into civil war, and the guy that was there as the ambassador from the U.S. was from Maine, and he's like, "Oh, this is my chance to get these sheep out." And so he took advantage of that, and that's why we have all these rock walls and everything all over New England. They cut everything down, was because of this massive, all of a sudden, expansion of merino wool in the U.S. that was much better quality, or softer, whatnot. But he explains like the rock walls, how the rock walls were built, where they'd throw the stuff, where you can find the pillow and divot, I think they call it. Yep. You can know when that tree went down, roughly decade, roughly the type of storm, roughly the type of season. like he tells you at the beginning of this video what you'll be able to know afterwards by just walking through a forest, and you're like, that's witchcraft. There's no way.
Yeah, but that's
and then you watch it.
Literally,
like,
the land has a story to tell, and
Yeah.
you can read the history of a piece of land or a place just by standing there and observing. And that's one of the
so
things that
interesting.
I really try to embed in my work as an educator, that what we see before us is not it's not the culmination of one thing. It's multiple systems at play within a period of time that we have no control over. And part of what we need to do as landscape architects is to think, how do we help that piece of land evolve to be able to withstand the pressures of climate change or the pressures of increased growth? Like, think about population growth alone. Like, we're putting a lot of pressure on our lands, and I think taking those cues and looking at the past historical patterns and getting a sense of that history, it only builds richness into the experience of a place. The second you divorce that from a place, it really loses something.
Yeah.
So
it's just, in speaking to someone like you and to watching videos like that, it turns you from someone who encounters a forest and feels like they cannot read and they cannot hear and they cannot see. They only see trees and dirt. Like, whatever, I'm going home. To then all of a sudden, like, I know how to read this. I know the story and the relationships that are happening here. This fell down and that grew on top of that. And that's why these roots are exposed in this. And it's just so interesting to like, oh, like you start to be able to read it.
Yeah,
and
it's everything. And,
so cool.
and it I think we're in a really unique time and place where that transformation, like we're transitioning from a post-agricultural landscape to one that is much more developed and built up. And who knows what 10 years from now parts of Maine look like that were once potato fields or that have, they've evolved.
Yeah,
so
they're already changing. I mean, out by our house, all the land that was farmland is already, there's houses. There's a few that people have put into the Saco Land Trust that won't be developed, and where we built was back in a forest where I think we basically built on granite hills. Like, there's no farmable land really on our land.
Soils, yeah.
It's very thin soil, but like where we built our house was on a huge flat slab of granite. We just had to clean it off, and then they poured the foundation right on rock.
That's cool.
It was just like, oh, all right, this is where we'll build.
Well, see, even that contributes on many levels to a reduced carbon footprint. You didn't blast the ledge out and like
that was a fight. She really wanted a
foundation and
wanted a foundation where we could put the potatoes and stuff in the winter. I was like, that's going to be a place for mold and all that. Let's figure out how to, and it saved us like 30 grand to not have to do fuller systems and concrete and but yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you so much for coming in and educating.
Awesome.
Thank you for educating people at Harvard to do the same thing moving forward. And I hope that as New England develops, that we figure out how to retain the charm, but also figure out how to responsibly, sustainably grow it and move it forward. And you seem to be a very positive and informed voice in that. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your time.
And how would people find out more about, for one, Matthew Cunningham landscape design and the farm lab, land lab?
So we're on social media. We're at MCLD LLC is the landscape architecture firm, and then MCLD Land Lab is the Instagram for the farm. We have a website, and I'd love to hear from people.
And hopefully there'll be some cool social media stuff coming up on the Land Lab from Trent Bell Photography sometimes. And Grace Bell Photography. Who knows? So, Matthew Cunningham, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.